Right now, somewhere on your computer, there's a button that cost Microsoft more money than most countries spend on their entire national infrastructure. And there's a good chance you've never clicked it on purpose. That's not an exaggeration. That's the actual story we're diving into today. Because what happened with Microsoft's biggest AI bet is one of the strangest, most revealing case studies in modern tech, a masterclass in how a company can have unlimited money, unlimited reach, and unlimited confidence, and still watch its own product get quietly ignored by the very people it was built for. Let's rewind to the moment this all started. Late 2022 into 2023, ChatGPT explodes onto the scene and becomes the fastest growing consumer application the world had ever seen. Every industry panics and pivots at the same time. And Microsoft, having already sunk billions into OpenAI, suddenly finds itself holding what looks like the winning lottery ticket. They already had thousands of enterprise relationships. They already had hundreds of millions of people opening Word, Excel, Outlook, and Teams every single day. So the logic seemed bulletproof. Take the most capable AI on the planet, wire it directly into the software billions of people already depend on, and watch adoption take care of itself. They named it Copilot, and they didn't roll it out quietly. Microsoft poured tens of billions of dollars into AI infrastructure in the years that followed. They rebuilt the Windows taskbar around it. They gave it a permanent icon in Word, Excel, and Outlook. They even added a dedicated Copilot key to new keyboards, the first new key Microsoft had introduced to a standard keyboard layout in decades. If you've ever wondered why your new laptop has a strange extra button where the right Carl key used to be, that's the one. Here's where the story starts to turn, though. Microsoft didn't just make Copilot available as something you could opt into if you were curious. In a lot of markets, it got folded directly into subscriptions people were already paying for, and the price went up right alongside it. In Australia, personal Microsoft 365 subscriptions jumped by around 45%, and family plans rose by close to 30%. Similar price hikes rolled out across New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Thailand. Microsoft framed it as the natural cost of adding a powerful new AI assistant into the product. Customers framed it very differently. A lot of people felt like they'd opened their renewal notice and discovered they were now paying significantly more for a feature they'd never asked for and, in many cases, didn't even know how to disable. It got serious enough that Australia's competition regulator, the ACCC, actually filed a lawsuit against Microsoft over it. The allegation was that Microsoft misled millions of customers into believing they had no choice but to move to the pricier Copilot bundled plan, while the cheaper Classic version without Copilot quietly existed the whole time, but was only revealed to customers once they started the cancellation process. Think about that for a second. A multi-billion-dollar regulatory case built entirely around the idea that a tech giant made its AI feature hard to say no to. That's not a minor PR headache. That's the kind of thing that ends up as a business school case study on how not to launch a product. So naturally, you'd assume that with that level of financial pressure and marketing muscle behind it, Copilot must have become a runaway hit inside Microsoft 365, right? This is where the numbers get genuinely stunning. An internal report that surfaced gave a rare, unfiltered look at how many people were actually using Microsoft 365 Copilot as a paid, licensed feature versus how many had access to it. The figure came out to roughly 8 million active licensed users. On its own, that might sound like a solid number for a brand new tech product. But remember the denominator here. Microsoft 365 has somewhere north of 400 million subscribers. When you run that math, you land on an adoption rate hovering around 2%. Independent industry trackers have landed on similar territory more recently too, describing enterprise-wide Copilot adoption as still sitting under 5%, even years after launch, with weekly active usage closer to just 1% of the total customer base. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a niche side feature Microsoft quietly tested and forgot about. This was, by a wide margin, the most heavily promoted, most heavily funded, most aggressively pushed initiative in the company's recent history. And after all of that spending, all of that positioning, all of that keyboard redesigning and taskbar rebuilding, the actual number of people choosing to use it week to week landed somewhere close to 1 in 100. It gets stranger when you look inside Microsoft itself. Employees who had Copilot handed to them for free as part of their own job were reportedly opening ChatGPT and Claude instead to get their actual work done. There were internal complaints describing the tool's interface as clunky and hard to rely on, with some employees openly calling have won by default. And then came a line from an industry analyst that landed like a gut punch to Microsoft's AI strategy. The observation that a rival AI company had essentially built the ideal version of Copilot for Excel inside Microsoft's own flagship spreadsheet software before Microsoft's own team had managed to do it, only to have outside commentators point out that a competitor did your own job better inside your own app without your permission. Meanwhile, the broader AI subscription market kept moving without Copilot. By early 2026, tracking of paid AI subscribers showed ChatGPT commanding well over half the market, somewhere in the mid-50s percentage-wise. Copilot's share, by contrast, sat around 11 to 14%, and even that slice had been shrinking, dropping close to 39% between mid-2025 and January 2026, as Google's Gemini surged past it. So not only was Copilot struggling to convert its enormous built-in audience into active users, it was also losing ground in the open market to competitors who didn't have anywhere near Microsoft's distribution advantage. Now, to be fair to Microsoft, the picture isn't uniformly bleak. By the middle of 2026, the company had reported meaningful growth in paid Copilot seats, climbing from around 15 million to 20 million in a single quarter, and executives pointed to rising weekly engagement numbers as proof the tool was gaining traction inside large enterprises. Microsoft's AI-related. It's a story about the enormous gap between having access to something and actually wanting to use it. Microsoft handed Copilot to hundreds of millions of people, essentially, for free through their existing subscriptions, and even with all of that reach, independent analysts still describe workplace conversion rates sitting far below what ChatGPT achieves with users who often have to actively choose and pay for it themselves. That gap between everyone technically has it and hardly anyone is choosing to open it is the real story here. There's a reason for that gap, and it isn't really a mystery once you look at what enterprise users have actually reported. Independent testing and user complaints have pointed to meaningful reliability issues, tools producing inconsistent results, contradicting information the user had, already confirmed or requiring so much double-checking that the supposed time savings evaporated. One widely circulated account documented a cluster of factual errors from Copilot within just a few days of business use, ranging from invented details to direct contradictions of information the user had explicitly provided. When a tool that's supposed to save you time instead requires you to fact-check everything it produces, it stops being a productivity boost and starts being a liability you have to actively manage. While all of this was happening with Copilot specifically, Microsoft was fighting an entirely separate battle over Windows itself. Windows 11 shipped with hardware requirements strict enough that millions of otherwise perfectly functional laptops and desktops were suddenly classified as unsupported. People who'd bought a solid machine just a few years earlier were being told, in effect, that their computer wasn't good enough anymore. Not because it stopped working, but because it didn't meet an arbitrary security chip requirement. Some of those users switched to Mac OS, some moved to Linux, some just stopped upgrading altogether, extending the life of Windows 10 machines for as long as they possibly could. At the same time, Windows 11 was dealing with a rough stretch of update reliability problems. Enough cumulative update issues over the course of a year that tech outlets were compiling running lists of them. Performance regressions, app crashes, and features breaking after routine patches became a recurring headline. And through all of that, Microsoft kept adding more Copilot entry points across the operating system, including, notably, inside Notepad, an app that had existed in more or less the same simple form since the mid-1980s. For a lot of longtime Windows users, watching a famously minimal, reliable little text editor get an AI icon bolted onto it became a symbol of something bigger. A company that seemed more focused on pushing its AI narrative than fixing the fundamentals people actually relied on every day. That tension boiled over publicly in late 2025. Microsoft's Windows leadership posted about a vision for turning Windows into what they called an agentic operating system. Essentially, a version of Windows where AI agents handle tasks across the system on your behalf. The backlash was immediate and loud. Developers, IT professionals, and everyday users flooded the replies with frustration, many of them pointing out that Microsoft seemed to be chasing a futuristic AI vision while ignoring long-standing complaints about stability, performance, and basic usability. The volume of negative responses got intense enough that the executive who posted it turned off replies entirely. He later responded elsewhere, acknowledging that the team had heard the feedback around reliability and performance loud and clear, and that there was clearly more work to do. To Microsoft's credit, this actually seems to have triggered a real course correction, at least partially. In the months that followed, Microsoft began talking publicly about a renewed focus on core performance and reliability in Windows, alongside a review of where Copilot had been inserted throughout the operating system. Some of those integrations have reportedly been pulled back or de-emphasized as the company tries to rebuild trust with the base of users and developers who felt like their operating system had quietly become an advertisement for a strategy they never asked to be part of. So what actually went wrong here, if we zoom all the way out? It's not that the underlying AI technology was fundamentally broken. Plenty of people genuinely do get value from AI tools. And that's proven daily by how many people voluntarily choose to use ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini without being forced into it. The real issue is that Microsoft appeared to confuse distribution with desire. Putting a feature in front of 400 million people doesn't automatically mean 400 million people want it. You can put a gym membership on somebody's credit card, but that doesn't mean they're going to show up and use it. Access isn't the same thing as adoption, and no amount of bundling, keyboard redesigns, or price restructuring can manufacture genuine demand for a tool that a meaningful chunk of your own workforce would rather avoid. There's a broader lesson in here for anyone paying attention to how the AI industry is unfolding right now, and it goes well beyond just Microsoft. We're in a moment where huge companies are racing to bolt AI features onto everything they own, sometimes without pausing to ask whether the feature is actually good enough to earn genuine voluntary use. Being first isn't the same as being trusted, being everywhere isn't the same as being wanted, and raising prices to fund a feature that a large share of your customers never asked for is a strategy that tends to generate resentment a lot faster than it generates loyalty, which is exactly what regulators in Australia are now formally investigating. If there's one thing worth taking away from this whole saga, it's this. Trust with your users isn't something you can bill for, and it isn't something a marketing budget can manufacture on its own. Once people start feeling like their software is quietly working for the company's roadmap instead of for them, that feeling is very hard to undo, no matter how many billions get poured into fixing it afterward. Microsoft has an enormous amount of resources, some of the best engineers in the world, and more distribution than almost any company on the planet. What this story shows is that none of that guarantees people will actually want what you're building. Sometimes the hardest problem in tech isn't building the technology, it's convincing people they genuinely need it, rather than just making sure they can't avoid it. If you found this breakdown interesting, you'll probably want to check out the video I did on how Windows 11's update problems have been quietly piling up over the past year. Because a lot of what's driving people away from Copilot connects directly to that same trust problem with the operating system itself. Stick around, and the biggest names in tech, and I'll see you in the next one.